Alright, so here we are for the second part of chapter 23, looking at human evolution. And up to this point, we've kind of just looked at what natural selection and evolution are and how they're related to each other, and kind of just looked at that generically. And now we're going to look more specifically at the history of human evolution. So the evolution of humans is pretty old, and we'll see a couple nice diagrams in a bit to visualize that. But anytime we're looking at evolution or just organisms in general, we want to look at classification. And we're mostly pointing this out just so that you can familiarize yourself with it. There's domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Some people just start with kingdom. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species is the way I learned it, so I can just kind of like run that off now. It took many times of me saying that to memorize it. The one phrase that helped me just remember it without ever needing to look back was King Philip came over for good sex. So if that works for you, go ahead and just hold on to that one and know that domain is the biggest. So domains, there's three big domains. There's the bacteria domain, the archaea domain, and the eukarya domain. And eukarya are everything that has a nucleus is in eukarya, and then bacteria and archaea are a little bit different. But what's interesting about this phylogeny, and that's what we're seeing here in the blue lines, is a history. So we see that bacteria actually branched off first, and then whatever this common ancestor was eventually broke into archaea, and then another line broke into eukarya. So we are actually more related. Obviously it's a distant relationship, but we're more related to archaea than we are to bacteria, which is kind of interesting. The other thing to point out here is that anytime you see a name of something, the genus and the species are italicized. So when you write Homo sapiens, it should be italicized or written in cursive. The other way to get around it, if your cursive isn't super hot, is to just underline it. That would also work. So that's what we expect. So that's why if you're reading the newspaper or if you're reading something in our book and it references a certain organism and it's italicized, that's because that is its scientific or Latin name. So when we talk about humans, humans are part of the group primates. Primates is actually an order, and so and think back to our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So we're part of the order primates, and characteristics of all primates is that they have an opposite or opposing thumb that you can contact the tip of your thumb with the tip of your other fingers, as opposed to your big toe. Your big toe, as long as you've got a normal bone structure, can't actually connect with the pinky or any other toes on your same foot. It's not opposable, but your thumb can do that. Depth perception, a well-developed brain, mobile limbs, being able to move them in all directions because those ball and socket joints, grasping hands, partially due to the opposite thumb, reduced offspring numbers with increased parental care. Think about most humans on the planet are going to have, especially as we increase the access to birth control, but other primates too are going to have reduced offspring. And even if we think about maybe 8 offspring, that's still significantly less than a dog that would perhaps have 8 in one litter and then have multiple litters, or certainly less than a mayfly, which would lay 800 eggs at the same time. So it's still a reduced number, but lots of parental care. And then all primates have learned behavior. There's a sign of a social interaction within that community of primates, and that's really important to their survival and their reproduction, and some learned behavior as well. So keep in mind, this of course applies to humans, but we're also thinking about apes, we're thinking about orangutans, we're thinking about gibbons, and even lemurs. So all of those things that are primates have these characteristics. There's 2 major groups of primates, the prosimians and the anthropoids. The anthropoids are just a little more like humans as opposed to the prosimians. So don't worry too much. Your book actually gives you a lot more information than I'm interested in you just simply memorizing. So we are going to look at different groups, and there are some characteristics for different groups or species we do want to know, but that's mostly for human history, and so we're looking at the pieces in here, and if there's a whole lot of extra in your book, you can mostly just skim over that. So when we look at humans, we're compared to chimpanzees. The chimpanzee is a recent ancestor of ours, or a cousin of ours, really. We share a common ancestor that wasn't a human and wasn't a chimpanzee. It was a third species. But because they're our, most recent cousin, we do compare to them often. So with humans, we're going to point out kind of these 6 characteristics that are kind of highlighted here. So the skull in humans, the spine is exiting from the center and it's exiting below the skull, as opposed to in chimpanzees, it's exiting in the back of the skull. Excuse me, because they're walking on their hands so much, and if you were crawling all the time, if you just crawl across the floor, in order to see, your head is cranked up. But if your spine was coming out the back of your skull, you wouldn't need to crank your head would just be looking forward in a sort of relaxed state. So that's kind of supporting that humans, right, had this bipedal or 2-foot gait instead of using 4. The spine in humans is S-shaped instead of C-shaped, or has 2 curves instead of 1. The pelvis in humans is bowl-shaped versus in chimpanzees it's longer and more narrow. In humans, the femurs are angling into our knees and they're not going out. And part of that, again, a lot of this is supporting that bipedal gait, using 2 feet to walk instead of 4 limbs to walk. And so that knee in humans has to support more weight, so it's a lot bigger. If you look at this sort of teal section in the human knee, it's significantly larger than when we look at the counterpart in the chimpanzee. So it's supporting a lot more weight, so it's a lot bigger. The foot has an arch in humans versus being very, very flat in chimpanzees, and that again is supporting that bipedal gait. Chimpanzees, it's not listed here, but you can see they have that opposable toe, that opposable big toe, that allows their feet to grasp tree limbs the way that your hands and their hands can grasp tree limbs. So there's some other characteristics too, but all of these are kind of supporting this transition from living in trees, living this brachial lifestyle of moving from limb to limb as opposed to walking on the ground. The evolution of primates, I know the text on this page is really, really tiny, but what we kind of want to point out is that we can look at how similar or different or just related two species are based on their DNA. We can, of course, use their external features as well, but DNA gives us this really nice and more refined information about the relationship, because there are neutral genetic changes accumulating in your body all the time and accumulating in generations over time. Because if you think back to that triplet code we were talking about with the GGC or the TGA, if the third one changes, a lot of times the DNA is changed, but actually the protein remains the same. And if you take a genetics class, you'll get into that all later, but you can just believe me for now that that's true. So that's what we call a neutral genetic change, and they accumulate with time, but the organism still exists just perfectly fine. There's just this little bitty change in the DNA, and we can use those changes because we know that they happen at this kind of particular rate, or an average rate, and we can use that as a molecular clock, and then we can kind of go back and see how many differences there are and use that as an estimated time of when two different species sort of split from each other, or that third species split into two different populations. So humans, apes, chimps, monkeys have all evolved from a common ancestor that was not an ape, a monkey, a chimp, or a human. It actually, for as far as we know, and our best estimate based on the fossil evidence, based on DNA, is that this mammalian ancestor was actually quite small as it entered trees, and then it maintained that brachial lifestyle for pretty much most of them until we get up to humans, which really were the first ones to become terrestrial again. So don't necessarily worry about memorizing this particular list here, but you can see these prosimians, anthropoids, hominoids, hominids, and hominines. So these are all words that are used to describe progressively smaller groups of primates. Lemurs to tarsiers, to New World monkeys, to Old World monkeys, to gibbons, to orangutans, to gorillas, to chimpanzees, and to humans. And every time you see this line extending from a break, remember that that was a common ancestor. So this was a common ancestor of gorillas, chimps, and humans. That was not a gorilla, it was not a chimp, and it was not a human. It was something else. We technically don't have a name for it. We would need to find a fossil, we would need to generate a name, and get that approved by the people who do that for a living, because they exist, and that's how we would finally name that particular species. All right, so we're going to focus now on hominins. That was the history of primates, and now we're really going to zone in on hominins, which are all species of the genus Homo, because Homo sapiens are the only species of that's living today, but there historically were other species that were very similar to us. And then there are some other close relatives of the genus Homo, but they're now dead and extinct. And so those classify hominins. Overall characteristics that we see in hominins is that they're bipedal. They have a flat face and a pronounced chin, as opposed to that chin sort of going into their neck. And think, look at a gorilla or chimpanzee and orangutan sometime, and you'll see that difference. And a large brain. And the brains, of course, do vary in size, and how flat the face is will vary, but those characteristics are going to be happening in a hominin. And the hominins split from the ape line of descent about 7 million years ago. This is the oldest fossil we have of a hominin, and so that's right now is our best estimate of when this split happened. So here is that 7 million years ago, right here. So this is where we see our first fossil for Sahelanthropus chadensis. And we'll go through each of these. I've included this here not for you to memorize it, but just to give you a sense of the fact that Homo sapiens, we're only up here. We've only existed for as long as this little blue bar is existing. And in the past, other Homo cousins of ours, other species that were similar to us, but not our actual species, have overlapped. And occasionally, there's some thought that these two might be the same species. There are ongoing debates, of course, in science even about which species are the same or different. But we do have different fossils to support these other ones. So just kind of this is a nice overview to see what's happened over the last 7 million years. So here's our human evolution timeline. This is a summary. These are the only dates I'm really concerned about you knowing. Again, there's that 7 million years ago is our first hominin fossil, Sahelanthropus chadensis. Then around 4.4 million years ago, we start seeing Ardipithecines, which is a group of different species. Then we see 3.7 to 2.9 million years ago, we see the Australopithecines, and we'll talk about these different groups in a moment. And then around 2 million years ago, we finally see the genus Homo. Up to this point, they've been other genuses. They've been different enough from Homo sapiens to be their own genus. And we finally see Homo habilis. Then we see Homo erectus. 200,000 years ago, we see Homo neanderthalensis. And then 100,000 years ago, we start seeing Homo sapiens, the earliest Homo sapiens that were called Cro-Magnons. And again, what we're going to do on the next 7 slides is work through these different groups. So Ardipithecines was found in Ethiopia. This is technically our second group. We're not going to look much at the chadensis one, partially just because we don't have much of a fossil for it, so there's not as much for us to go on. So the Ardipithecines were first found in Ethiopia in Africa. If you don't know where it is, please look up a map and check it out. Ape features. So what we're going to look at for kind of each of these is what ape features did they have versus Homo features, because we're slowly going to see this movement from more ape features to more Homo features. It was only about 4 feet tall, about 110 pounds, had a relatively small brain. It was big enough to be considered a hominin, but still relatively small. The muzzle was forward, a low forehead, an opposable big toe. But the Homo features it had was that it had very small teeth, and it had a bone in its foot that is really, really helpful for being bipedal. And it's actually an extra bone that bipedal organisms like us have, but other organisms like chimpanzees and gorillas do not. Then we see the Australopithecines. They were also found in eastern and southern Africa. Ethiopia is certainly eastern, but not so much southern, so this is a little bit broader. The ape features that Australopithecines had was that the limb proportions were very similar, longer arms, shorter legs, again, a smaller brain. But we know that it walked upright because we found numerous footprints. We found a skeleton, and remember that skeleton can show you where the hips are, what's the angle of the legs, how big are the knees. Those sorts of things can indicate if an organism was bipedal. And this, one of the fossils we found is Lucy. If you've ever heard of the fossil of Lucy. Lucy was an Australopithecine, and her skeleton is about 3.18 million years old. And of course, we've just given her the name Lucy. We have no idea what she would have been called, but that's kind of how she's been identified. And this is an artist's rendering based on the skeleton and based on what we know about, how muscle and other tissues and fat come on the bodies of humans and other organisms. This is what we estimate Lucy would have looked like.